So please give a hand and welcome Guy Doxey to
Thanks, everyone. So I've lived on Vancouver Island for 30 years. Before that, I was in Britain for another 40 years. And I've been very active in the climate solutions field for the last 25 years, working full-time on how do we address the climate crisis. And so for all of those 25 years, I've had that sinking feeling in your belly that when you really understand the climate crisis, you go, holy shit, it's bad. And I have a little simple thing that if you haven't had that sinking feeling in your belly, you haven't understood how bad the climate crisis is. And now we have a parallel ecological crisis. So I took the last 3 years to dig a level deeper into understanding the climate crisis than I'd done before by studying economics for 3 years, economics and economic history. Because every decision that's being made to invest in more fossil fuels or do this or that is premised on economic assumptions and models and rule books. And in fact, for all of my life, ever since I left school, I've been asking the question like, what the hell is wrong with this world? Why is it that at the time, going back to the 1960s, nature seemed harmonious and humans seemed to be in a mess? Like, what gives? So I was asking why all the time. And so I've got a lot of years of deeper philosophical questioning. But as a result of the last 3 years of deep immersion in economics, tied to that bigger questioning, I've come up with the reality that there are simply 4 reasons for all the mess we're in. And there are 4 solutions. And I've got them here on 8 pieces of paper. The first 9 pieces of paper, actually. The first one is simply my website, www.thepracticalutopian.ca, where all of my work is set aside. So before we get to the 4 fundamental reasons, just to remind ourselves of the extent of the mess we're in, the climate crisis is, whenever there are curves showing expected temperature rise over the last 25, 30 years, the reality has been at the very top end of the curve. The worst case scenario has been what actually happened. The Arctic is melting faster than expected. Antarctica is melting faster than expected. Permafrost melting faster than expected. Sea level rise rising faster than expected. The Paris Climate Treaty suggested that try to get an agreement to sort of limit the rise in emissions to 1.5 degrees. With the current treaty agreements on the table by countries, we're heading to a 3 to 4 degree temperature rise. And the last time the world was 3 degrees warmer, the sea level was 25 meters higher. Not feet or centimeters, but meters higher. That's the height of an 8-story building. And so what's happening is we're getting more drought, more storm, more hurricane, more intensity to all this stuff. And just in practical terms, if you think about that sea level rise and the range of the tides going up and down, how many beaches in the world on which tourism is so dependent will actually cease to exist because of sea level rise? And then you think about the impact of flying and the emissions from flying on the problem, how much tourism depends on flying. So put those things together, and the interface with tourism and the climate crisis is just immense. It's a huge, big thing. In addition to that, we've got a parallel ecological crisis. Like just since 1970 in Germany, they've been measuring the insects in the nature reserves. In fact, the last 25 years, since 1905, a 75% loss of insect life in the nature reserves in Germany. Since 1970, a 60% decline on the whole planet in the number of fish, birds, mammals, amphibians, reptiles. A third of all species are now red listed of being at risk of extinction. So when I use the term GDP, which is gross domestic product, I retranslate it in my mind to be gross depletion of the planet. Because that's actually what's happening. Every time we consume more, we're depleting the planet. Then when we look at the food and farming, there's 800 million people don't get enough food to lead an active, healthy life, and more than 1 billion people are obese because they get too much food. We've got the fact that raising livestock and dairy is using 83% of the world's farmland. but only giving us 18% of our calories. So we've got a real challenge around where our food supply comes from when especially we put future droughts into that. Then there's economic problems, like, to understand how much money the plutocrats of the world are hiding through tax evasion. And it's somewhere between, 8% and sort of 20% of the world's wealth, at least $7.6 trillion and maybe up to 25 trillion being hidden in tax havens where the money can't be taxed to pay for the kind of solutions we need. And then there's inequality, the growing inequality that 82% of all the wealth being generated on the planet is going to the 1% richest people on the planet. And in America, the net worth of a top billionaire, which is like 80 billion, is 1 million times greater than the net worth of a teacher here at Royal Roads or equivalent college. 1 million times greater. It's complete discord in terms of what we expect from an economy and from nature. So the things work together, right? So in Canada, the net worth of Canadians who have $30 million or more in assets, in 2018 alone, their net worth jumped by 15%. The net worth of the average Canadian fell by 0.2%. So in the last 3 years, I've read 260 books on economics and economic history. And virtually every single one of them says, this is all screwed up. This is not working. We need a new economic model. And they play around with some ideas. So I spent the last 3 years developing that, and actually for a book that's not been published yet called The Economics of Kindness, a 10-year transition to a green cooperative economy. So that brings me to the first of our 4 fundamental reasons for what's going wrong in the world. And it's very simply ecological ignorance. There's no one really to blame for this. We didn't know there was an ozone layer up there until the planes started sort of flying around and discovering there was a hole in it. We've had cabinet ministers who don't know what the carbon cycle is, and corporate CEOs. We have, all of us effectively don't understand the microecology of our own guts and how the microbiome interacts with antibiotics and stuff like that. We are expecting ourselves to run a whole planet without a clue about the operating system of that planet, which is ecological. And so because this is the easiest one to deal with, the solution to this is simply ecological knowledge. 2 words. So just as we expect every child to leave school with reading, writing, and arithmetic, they should also be leaving school with regenerative ecology. Every student should understand ecology and the fundamental principles of ecology. You should not be allowed into a university unless you passed an exam in Ecology 101. You should not be allowed to run for a public office in an election unless you've done a course in Ecology 101. So that's some of the nonsense that gets spoken by the climate deniers. Oh, it's caused by the sun, or it's caused by volcanoes, which is really, it's what I call PI syndrome, which stands for proud ignorance. Technically, there's a thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which shows that when you're a state of knowledge between knowing nothing and knowing a lot, and the confidence level, it starts at 0, then it gets up high, then it comes down, and it goes up like that. So the people who know a lot are confident that what they really know. The people who know nothing. But up here, proud ignorance is when people think they know a tiny bit, and they think they turn it into everything. Well, I know that the volcanoes are causing the climate crisis, and all you young people are just, being brainwashed by some left-wing Marxist socialists to tell us there's a climate crisis to destroy the corporations. And they're proud of saying that because they're 60 years old and they're white and they've got a university degree. And it's just proud ignorance, basically. And so ecological knowledge is absolutely critical for all of us. We can't operate without understanding how our planet works. I mean, how many of you know how, if you were driving horizontally and you wanted the equivalence of leaving the atmosphere, how far would you have to drive before you left the atmosphere? Anyone got a guess? Be brave. Be willing to make a fool of yourself. Failure is the first precondition for success. Anyone have a go? How far do you have to drive to leave the atmosphere?
A couple hundred kilometers.
Couple of hundred kilometers? Any advance on that bet?
35.
30 is the answer. 30 kilometers and you're outside the atmosphere. That's how thin it is. So when you look at Earth from space, you can hardly see the atmosphere. And all of our collective pollution is in there. All of the phenomenal carbon dioxide, carbon emissions that were accumulated over millions of years of pre-dinosauric activity by photosynthesis, growing trees, growing fish, which then got, smushed and crushed and buried at the bottom of the ocean underground and turn out in coal, oil, and gas. We dig them up, and we burn a couple of hundred, maybe 150 million years worth of photosynthesis, carbon, and we burn it in 200 years. Boom, a great surge of carbon into the atmosphere, and we get this carbon traps heat. Heat is driving climate change. So the second big cause goes into the reality of power. And when I come to the third cause, you'll see that power is excluded from economic analysis in neoclassical economics. So the second fundamental problem is the ancient impulse to dominate. So I first started tuning into this when I was reading about our hunter-gatherer ancestors, who for 300,000 years, until about 10,000 years ago, lived in a very aggressively cooperative, egalitarian way. It's still the way most First Nations live today. They did not like people becoming self-important. They did not like people trying to dominate, because they knew that if someone became self-important and were allowed to dominate, it could lead to murder, rape, and general nastiness all around. All of us have seen bullies who can get away with it. We all have an impulse within us to bully if we can get away with it. Well, not all of us, but it's there among us. And so then my question was, well, going back to our chimpanzee ancestors, and we share 99% of our genes with the chimpanzees, they have a very, very hierarchical way of living with alpha males, and even among the women, there's always jockeying for power, and you're either an alpha male or a beta male. How did that change? Like, what gives? How did the hunter-gatherers become so cooperative? And the research to understand all this is still very new. Jane Goodall only started living with chimpanzees in the 1970s. The books on anthropology and ethology looking at chimpanzee behavior weren't around when Karl Marx did his philosophical analysis or when Hume and Berkeley did their stuff. They're new. This understanding is new. And what it's showing us is that the instinct to power and to build a hierarchy, to be someone more important than others, is very deep within all of us. And power is something, we were led to believe that power is something you grab. You're a nasty man, I'll grab you. But actually power is something we give people because they're good. We like what they do. They tell us a story we want to believe. Trump supporters are giving him power because they want to believe the story Trump says, which is we will make you, the white people, important again. And this impulse is there within all of us. But what happens is that among about a third of the people who have power, it goes to the head. And power leads to self-importance and bullying and aggression and some really, really bad behavior. Not just through kings and princes and warlords, but also through slavery and the worst of slavery and the worst of colonialism, of imperialism. There's we only have to study history to know that all these bad things are happening. And they're all premised on this ancient impulse to dominate. Basically, what appeared to happen is that as humans evolved, and we first started getting two things, spears and language. So I'm going to say you're a big alpha male dominant. Go on, give us a big dominating show, right? You can do it. You can do a big dominating male. Yeah, right, you're a big deal. And he's got bigger claws and bigger teeth, and so we can't. If one-to-one, I can't do anything. I can't win a battle with you because you're always going to beat me up. But when we develop the spear, we say we're really pissed off with him. We're going to get together. We can throw a spear at him, and he's out of the game. Then we look at ourselves and say, well, who's the next alpha male? Not me. Because the spear changes the whole game, plus language. The two together basically push the primate alpha male out of the game. So you've either got to disappear now and go to another tribe, or be mellow and put your tail between your legs for a long time, right? And so then when they discovered that by being cooperative, that life was just a damn sight more pleasant. You're not dealing with bullies all the time and the constant aggression. All of us know that who've been through school and known bullies. You can also hunt more effectively as a cooperative team, and you can defend yourself against enemies and actually go into battle more effectively, cooperatively. And so here's the interesting thing, is that what happened to cause the hunter-gatherers to lose their cultural reign based on cooperation? And the basic answer is food surpluses. So when we discovered through agriculture we could actually gather more food than we needed, we don't have to share it all anymore. Or when the First Nations came down the west coast of Canada and discovered the sea was just full of oysters and mussels and shells and food, they'd start taking the best places, best fishing places, they'd start herding it so that the individual impulse returned. And the individual impulse was basically suppressed during our hunter-gatherer years, which was important for the survival of the clan in a very difficult situation, but it's a bit of a bore if you want to be an individual and achieve something. So after the hunter-gatherer societies, there were actually what's called achievement societies for about 5,000 years, when people still held a hunter-gatherer ethic of cooperating, but you're allowed to accumulate goods, you're allowed to go out and see how many heads you can cut off and wave around, you can get jewels and bling you gather up to boost your ego up. But you can't pass any of this on to your children, there's no inheritance. And when the successful people in achievement societies began to use inheritance, then it was game over for cooperation, because with inheritance, new generation gets acquired power and weapons and wealth, and you can throw a feast. And you throw a feast so big that everyone has to go into debt in order to throw a reciprocal feast, to balance that. Because if you invite people around to dinner, you'll get invited back. This principle of reciprocity is deep into the cooperative impulse within us all. But once domination came back through inheritance, we're into debt slavery, actual slavery, conquest, and it was game over for the cooperators. But throughout the era of human history that we studied, which is the last, say, 5,000 years, it's all been based on domination by pharaohs, by kings, by priests. There have always been slave revolts. There have always been peasant revolts, and they always got crushed. They were defeated, and 3,000 people would be hanged or executed or slaughtered. Never any success, but the impulse was there, because none of us like being dominated. We don't like being told what to do, but if he's got a gun and I haven't, I can't do much about it. Until the Renaissance opened up thinking, led to the Enlightenment, and the questioning and the sense of human rights, and then traveling around the world for the first journeys of exploration in the 1600s, 1700s, people realized that in Europe, the big Christian definition of the world may not be the only one there is. Maybe they do things differently in India. Maybe China's had a civilization that's been going for 5,000 years. There's people saying, oh, we're not all just the biggest, most important white people. There's other people in the world with other cultures. And they started to get a sense of relative difference and of the importance of individual human rights. And so that led to this saying we need democracy. And democracy is the single most important thing that can defeat autocracy and domination. So the struggle happening in Hong Kong today is at deep level a struggle around democracy. The struggles happening in Europe with Brexit and in North America with Trump, who would ideally like to destroy democracy, they're part of this struggle between domination and cooperation, because the solution to the ancient impulse to dominate is simply the ancient impulse to cooperate. We still have it. We do virtually everything in life by cooperation. We live among people who are complete strangers, and we ride the trains, we pay taxes, we go to shops, we don't get into fights. Our life's incredibly peaceful because we're exercising a really high level of cooperation. Then we do some competition within that, because you can't get a successful economy without businesses competing with each other, or else if there's no competition, you can just be a lousy business. You end up like Soviet Russia in the 1980s when there's nothing happening because there's no joy of spark in business. But the impulse to cooperate is what led to the first people uniting together to get the children out of the coal mines, to get independence for India, to basically lead the Chinese Revolution, was, cooperate against the old dynasties, to get the vote for women, to tackle the climate crisis, the 500,000 people on the streets of Montreal, the 100,000 in Vancouver, the 20,000 in Victoria 2 days ago, were all cooperating together for a greater goal. And so that impulse to cooperate is an absolutely key piece of everything we're doing. And is a key piece of understanding how we're going to change the world. So there's a problem, though, because the third big cause is false neoclassical economics. How many of you done a degree in economics here? Some of you? No. Well, 100% of universities around the world teach neoclassical economics, which was basically created in the 19th century. And classical economics was created by Adam Smith, basically saying, you know, we need to, the market works this way, that way, allow individuals to trade, and everything will work out well. And neoclassical economics added some other principles to that. So what's happening in the 1800s, we're talking 1870, 1880, is that the economists really, really, really want to be scientists. Because as scientists, they get more status, more self-respect, more importance, and more pay. And during the 1800s, science was making phenomenal breakthroughs. We got the laws of, you know, electricity coming out of nowhere. We got understanding about principles of biology. We got the understanding of how evolution works through Darwin. So people really had huge respect for science, and quite correctly so. So the economists said, well, if economics is a science and we become the scientists, we can learn how to fix this and change that, and we'll have happiness for everyone. In order to do that, they had to find a unit of energy equivalent to the atom. They said, well, that unit of energy is a rational, self-interested man who always behaves in the same way. The only thing he does in life is maximize his self-interest. So you call him Homo economicus in the Latin terms. And if Homo economicus always acts in this way, in a free market, if the price of something goes up, they'll buy less. If wages go down, more people will work. We'll get economic equilibrium. That's a law of economics, a supposed law of economics. And if we get economic equilibrium as the goal, the government should never interfere in the laws of economics because they're just going to mess things up. Governments should, therefore, the principle coming out of all this is that governments should not interfere in the laws of economics. And here's the puzzling thing, is first of all, it is totally not true that we all act rationally and selfishly. Even if we all did act selfishly all the time, we're certainly not all rational. I mean, you ever heard of gambling? Gambling is what goes on in the world stock markets every single day. You don't know what your bid's going to get. And the conclusion coming out of that, which is that government shouldn't intervene, happens to be really, really convenient for anyone who's dominant in the economy, who doesn't want rules to control greenhouse gases, who doesn't want, you know, labor unions, who doesn't want rules to stop pollution, because all those things interfere with profits. And in 1970, the economist Milton Friedman actually made the clear statement that the only purpose, following neoclassical economics, the only purpose for a business is to maximize its shareholder value and the profits going back to its owners and investors. Any other social or environmental responsibility is wrong, it's a waste of time, it shouldn't be done. And furthermore, the government shouldn't interfere, so they shouldn't do it either. The market will look after that. He actually argued that it's more efficient for developing world countries to collect trash and have polluting industries because individual lives in China or India are worth less than lives in North America. So they should have more trash because it's better for their economy, right? And here's a top economist actually believing he can argue that nonsense and believing he can get away with it, which shows how crazy the whole discipline of economics is. On top of that, built into these assumptions, you've got the assumption that economics is a science, which is not. Then there's the assumption that, well, nature can be ignored because it doesn't fit into our models. So nature in the neoclassical economics is an externality. The climate crisis is an externality. The extinction of birds is an externality. People getting lung cancer is an externality. People getting lung disease from vaping is an externality of the vaping industry. The third assumption, all humans are rational, self-interested. So built into this is the assumption that purpose doesn't matter. Because the only purpose that's built into the model is the purpose of getting rich. of being rational and self-interested for personal gain, and gain is always measured in terms of money. So you can begin to see this is the operating system on which our world's economy is working. Free markets generate efficient equilibrium, no evidence that it's true whatsoever. There wasn't much equilibrium in 2008 when the whole economy collapsed because of gambling on Wall Street. Less government, the better. More money equals more happiness. It's part of the economic beliefs. Economic growth is always good. If you have economic growth of 3% a year for the planet as a whole, you can do the maths of this by dividing into 72. 3 into 72 goes something like 21 or 25. It means the planet doubles every 24 years. The sheer volume of stuff will double every 24 years, and then again, and then again. And yet the assumption is we can continue doing economic growth forever because it's built into the models. That's a good thing. Then built into that is that communities don't matter because in economics there's only microeconomics about individual price behavior and macroeconomics to do with fiscal policy and government taxation and central banking. Communities do not exist on the radar of neoclassical economists. And that power doesn't matter either. It's just, we'll paint over that with a nice white brush so we can't see power, because the more invisible it is, the better. Because in reality, power is absolutely pervasive. You go to any international trade talks at the World Trade Organization, it's all about power. It's not about an equal agreement and cooperation between equal nations. America's, and Britain's role in the World Trade talks is how much can they squeeze out of the smaller countries. And it's a battle, it's a warfare battle going on. So it's quite staggering to me to understand. When I first started studying economics, it was like doing a Sudoku puzzle in 3 dimensions when half the puzzle was covered in fog and you couldn't see it. The fog was neoclassical economics, saying these are the principles on which things work. So I had to understand that they're just not true. And the bizarre thing is, you won't find a single university that teaches neoclassical chemistry or neoclassical physics. They just don't do it. Why would they teach neoclassical economics? Because it's so beneficial to the big corporations and the big plutocrats. The solution then is simply real-world economics. It's known in the trade as heterodox or pluralist economics. And it starts with the assumption economics is not a science, it's a branch of anthropology. It's a study of human behavior. That nature matters. Nature's the #1 beginning and end of everything. We can't have any economy without nature. That democracy matters because that's how we decide on purpose. Once purpose is no longer automatically simply maximize self-interest, and we're now operating cooperatively, we say, what is purpose? Well, you think it's this, and you think it's that, and you think it's different. So we sit down and talk about it through democracy. We have to decide what purpose is. And power matters. Understanding how power matters, and if someone's being super powerful, you've got to learn to overcome that. Among the hunter-gatherers, when someone got too big for their boots, they suppressed that by using joking and humor. They teased them remorselessly. Same thing happens throughout First Nations. Always teasing each other, bring them down a peg. Ostracism, stop talking to them, drive them out of the clan, and if need be, they'd assassinate them. If someone was a serial rapist or a murderer, they get together and assassinate that person to stop dominating, to keep the cooperative rules. And so within an economy, it can be a struggle between labor unions and factory owners. It can be all sorts of things, that trade wars that determine what is the nature of power in this. And now we're talking an analysis of power, which is deep into human social studies. I won't even use the word social science. It's an analysis of how we live together and how we understand our behaviors. The social economy matters, the public economy matters, community matters, and money matters, all these things. Bizarrely, in neoclassical economics, they do not study money. I think I'm going to invest in expanding because the economy is falling. So the investors pull their money back and you get a collapse in aggregate demand because of debt, because too much money isn't going in debt. And whenever you pay interest in debt, it's going from a lower income person to a higher income person. I happen to be half owner of a farm across the road where we live up in Ladysmith, and we just in the process of selling it to organic farmers. But there's another cottage on the place which pays me $700 a month in rent. So that the girl who's working there, 26-year-old, she works in a restaurant as a waitress, work, and then she gives me $700 as her rent. which she thinks is a good deal because it's fairly cheap, right? But to me, it's just money, because I have to repair the roof and I have to pay the taxes and do the insurance, but I still come out a net profit. And so I get richer and she gets poorer, or she doesn't get any richer. So the nature of debt is deeply linked into the way our economy works. In real-world economics, you're working on these different principles, and you're taking something like a community economics and putting it right at the center of things. So we know that when people in a community get together, we could be a community here, and we say, how can we help people start a business? How can we help people start a cooperative? If we set up a credit union instead of a bank, all the profits will remain among the owners and circulate locally among ourselves, instead of being profit, bank, Wall Street, and it's left the community. How do we support locally owned businesses where the money circulates locally? How do we, build community wealth so that we have good public transport, affordable housing, low-cost loans, affordable childcare? That's community thinking at the community economy level. And it becomes a very powerful vision of how communities can develop. Without that way of thinking, a low-income struggling community is just struggling, and they don't know what to do. The origin of organized cooperative community economics started in Germany in the 1800s, and in Europe in general, with people living in villages, and so hard pushed, and there was a particular innovation to start simply a peasants' financial cooperative, or farmers' financial cooperative, where they'd pool little bits of money, and they could lend to each other. When you're in a non-regulated market at the mercy of moneylenders, you can be paying 1,000% interest a year. And if you don't pay your interest, you're going to get kneecapped or you're going to get beaten up. Because that's the reality of power in that kind of economy. When people organize together and set up a credit union or a cooperative, they're sharing the principles of economics together, and the evidence shows they're just as successful financially. Cooperative businesses, employee-owned businesses, cooperative banks have a better economic record. During the 2008 crash, when banks went down all over the place, very, very few cooperatively owned banks went down. And it's tied to the principle also that the more women sit on the board of a bank, the less dangerous risk it takes, and the more successful the bank is. Because women are sort of not thinking, they haven't got that macho, oh, let's take this dangerous bet, we can make a lot of money on this one. They're saying, oh, wait a minute, I'm not so sure about that. So there's a very practical new economy being built on the ground that under the radar of neoclassical economics, none of this is taught in any of the world's university economics departments or business degrees. Everyone studying for a business degree or an economics degree is being brainwashed with 18th, 19th century nonsense. And it's really dangerous because that is the operating system of our planet's economy. And just as we have ecological ignorance, we don't know how our ecological system works, neither do we know how our economic system actually works. Because the ground rules we're following are based on completely erroneous assumptions from the 19th century. So then finally we come to the fourth fundamental cause. The first fundamental cause of our problem is ecological ignorance. Second fundamental cause, the ancient impulse to dominate, which we need to balance with cooperation. The third fundamental cause was faulty neoclassical economics, which we need to correct with real-world economics. And the fourth fundamental cause is the loss of our civilizational story. As a planetary culture, we don't know where we're going anymore. And if you think back in history, I'll give a European context, or it could be a Chinese context. In a European context, until the year 1500, it was the Catholic Church. They told you what culture was all about. They said, the incredible cathedrals that got built in order to make sure that, you were in good favor with God when you died and you made enough prayers. That was the definition of culture. In China, it'd be, really honor Confucius. Make sure you honor the family and do all the right stuff by the family. With the Reformation coming out of when power went to the heads of the Catholic Church, you got the corruption in the Catholic Church, hence the Reformation, people started thinking individually for themselves. Bear in mind that you are not allowed to read the Bible in your own language. The first person in England who translated the Bible into English, a guy called Tyndale, was burnt for doing that, burnt alive for translating it, because the priests wanted it in Latin in order that no one else would understand it. And the neoclassical economists write all of their stuff in formulae that no one can understand because they like it that no one else can understand it. The Reformation began to bring individual thinking and questioning. When we come to the Enlightenment, suddenly we're getting a new culture arriving. Progress, reason, science, travel, understanding, listening, respect. And the old Catholic stuff was just swept under the table, and progressively all the religious stuff entirely was swept under the table. Because what we discovered coming out of the Enlightenment was that when you tie progress, when you tie science, engineering, and individual innovation, and business, and investment, and entrepreneurship, you get miracles. You get a transformation of our economic landscape that can abolish poverty. Really, the phenomenal change. 200 years ago, a typical mother would have 10 children, and 9 would die in childbirth, or from some disease after that. All of us, most people lived with constant threat of famine, and the knowledge of famine and death from famine, or disease or plague. The fact that we've done so much progress comes out of a combination of the freeing of the mind that came with the Enlightenment, leading to the sense of let's discover things, let's inquire. There's no such thing as a set truth. We need to find out what the truth is by scientific methods. That led us to discovering the use of fossil fuels, engineering, and now we can take a little black thing called a cell phone and speak to someone in Australia with it, with quantum theory built into the mechanics of that cell phone. It's quite phenomenal. So our civilization had a real sense of purpose all the way from the 1700s through 1950, 1960, 1970. Hippies started giving some trouble. The hippies started saying, oh, what's all this about? 1980s, climate crisis stuff. People saying, oh, wait a minute. Put the brakes on here. We're heading for a frigging cliff. We're over the cliff. This is danger territory. We can't keep on going forward. And whenever you hear on the radio people who are denying the climate crisis, they're basically saying, economic growth will solve these problems for us, and you can't say no to progress, all that sort of stuff. Just to give a sense of this, I'll come to the next thing first. And so I often give talks in high schools, and I'll get all 400 kids on the floor of the gym. And I'll say to them at the beginning, when you think about the future, what do you feel? Hope or fear? Out of 400 kids, I get 395 hands go up for, hope or worry. 395 hands go up for worry, and 5 go up for hope. And it happens in high schools in Canada and Japan, the 2 countries I've done this in, exactly the same result. There's an epidemic of ecological anxiety and worry about the future happening among young people. And it's rational, and they should be worrying. But it means that no one wants to go charging ahead with more economic growth, more progress, because everything's good anymore. So we've lost our civilizational story. And one of the prime things you learn if you engage in sports or in business, if you want to be successful, you've got to visualize what success is. Bianca Andreescu, the Canadian 18-year-old who just won the American, the New York Open, from the age of, I think, 13 or 14 onwards, she was meditating, visualizing winning, visualizing. At the age of 16, she wrote herself a fake check for the winning amount of how much she was going to win. That's called visualizing purpose, visualizing success. Everyone in business knows the same principles. You learn that in business schools, visualize success. So what are we doing as a civilization? How many Hollywood movies have you seen celebrating dystopia, collapse, and chaos versus those celebrating a beautiful utopian future? It's like 100 to 0. It's how can we invent the latest 15-eye bugged spider beetle alien that's going to invade the earth and take us all over? That's what Hollywood thinks is the future is, because they're feeding on this sense of everything is going to collapse. And then what that means is we all just stop in the headlights. Like, oh, can't do anything now. And if you're not moving forward, meanwhile, the investors, the plutocrats, the corporations that want to make more money, build more coal-fired power plants, build more airports, they're rolling ahead. So standing still just means that you're being helpless and rolling over while disaster happens. So we need a solution. And so after quite a number of years involved in thinking about what's the single words that express where we're going, What is the new vision? The answer is this. It's a new ecological civilization. That is the phrasing that best captures the new sense of where we're heading as a planet. So I've lived on Vancouver Island for 30 years now, and I live in a culture of people who are really already doing this. They're deep into the principles of locally grown food, growing food organically, saving the forest, recycling as much as they can, not using chemicals, respecting nature, knowing that nature is sacred, honoring the First Nations. They're really understanding what that means. But we can't afford this transition to be a 100-year transition. We haven't got time for that. This is the dilemma. The scientists are saying around the climate crisis that if we want to keep the world's temperature below 1.5 degree temperature increase, we're currently at 1 degree temperature increase, Celsius, we have to get a 50% reduction in global emissions within 10 years and 100% elimination of all emissions by 2050. But that includes Russia and China and India and Indonesia. Indonesia is still opening up huge new coal mines to sell coal to China, to put into new coal plants that are being planned. The investors are still putting money into new natural gas pipelines, new oil pipelines across Canada, new coal mines. The very things that are destroying our planet, the investors are still pouring money in. And yet we have this 10-year deadline thing. And that 10 years, just to not take the temperature above 1.5 degrees, does not include the fact that pollution and sulfur dioxide emissions are shielding us from global warming. There's more heating out there. Once we get rid of pollution, we'll have some of that. They're not accounting for the melting permafrost. They're not accounting for social equity, that it's much easier in Canada to get our emissions down to zero, buy an electric car, put a heat pump in the house, than it is if you live in India or China. And so really we need to be looking for 100% reduction in emissions, ASAP. I was recently speaking to people on Denman Island, which is an island of 1,000 people. Meeting like this, 120 people came out, and I said, can you make a commitment that the whole island will be 100% climate friendly and nature friendly within 5 years? And 80% of all the hands went up to say, yes, we need to do that, we need to work on it, because they had a sense of the urgency of all this and the need for leadership. And so the way the new ecological civilization is coming together at the moment is through a concept called a Green New Deal. The New Deal was something that happened in the 1930s as a response to the economic crash of 1929 and the Depression, which were caused by neoclassical economics and people saying you shouldn't interfere. With the New Deal, Keynesian economics came into play, and President Roosevelt said, we're going to have big time in government investment. We'll create jobs. We'll do soil preservation. We'll put money into the arts. We'll just invest, invest, invest. And it pulled America out of the Depression. And New Deal economics dominated the economic governance of most countries between 1940 and 1980 for that period. China, India, Taiwan, Korea, they all used heavy government involvement in businesses to guide investment, to guide the way things are done, to keep the economy rolling along. Come 1980, and the neoclassical economists returned with Margaret Thatcher and Reagan. They get that stuff off the table, deregulate, 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 let the money makers free to make more money, and suppress the labor unions was what happened since then. So the Green New Deal is the concept of putting together the massive investment needed to invest in solar energy, wind energy, electric vehicles, sustainable organic farming and stuff like that, and all the jobs that come out of that, and combine it with an emphasis on making sure that every community that's affected, what's called a frontline community, if you're working in a coal plant, and you say, I'm going to lose my job, say, don't worry, we'll give you guaranteed income, training, whatever it was, so that you're supported in the transition while we train you to be a solar installer, a wind turbine manufacturer, whatever it is. There's a huge number of jobs available in retrofitting every single building so that you no longer need to heat it with oil or gas, using heat pumps, super efficiency. Huge number of jobs to be had from building all the wind turbines, building geothermal installations, building tidal energy devices, building solar panels. And so it's a very rapid transition we're talking about. And I just completed an analysis, which I published 2 days ago, of 10 Green New Deals. in the world, from Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Jay Inslee, 3 candidates for US president, US Congress resolution, US Green Party, Canada's Green Party, Canada's New Democrats, Britain's Labour Party, and a group from a new European political party called DiEM25, which is a new, they've all put together a Green Deal and analysed all of the components of those. It's like 25 pages long. You can find it all on my website, The Practical Utopian. And overall, it's really encouraging because some really strong policies in there. And really good, people are beginning to understand how you integrate transforming the economy with transforming our ecosystems and our environmental problems, and you bring them together. What I found in the last 3 years is that most environmentalists know as little about economics as most economists know about the environment. They're just completely separate. I will still go into a room of environmental people and say, how many of you know what quantitative easing is? So in this room, how many of you know what quantitative easing is? So this is the #1 method used by the world's central banks to pump money into the economy when everything is going downhill. Central banks print money out of thin air. They don't need to have it, they just print it. It's been happening for years. But when they printed it to save the 2008 crash, the way they do it is if the banks are holding toxic mortgages or bad bonds or stuff like that, they're pretty worthless. The central bank prints some money, buys it off them, and transfers all that money into the banks. The banks then lend that money out at interest. But they don't lend that money, they lend 10 times more money out at interest, because banks also create money out of thin air. The banks don't have the money they lend you when they lend you a loan. They just invent it based on their reserves, which is typically 10%. So if you've got $10 in the bank, you can lend 100. So the central bank creates money out of thin air, gives it to the banks. The theory was that the banks would lend it to businesses who would employ people. But the businesses looked at the world economy and said, it's a bit wobbly. I don't want to do that. So where do they lend it? They lent it to home buyers. They lent it into the real estate market, to property owners and house buyers, which is why the housing prices went up, which is why we have the housing crisis. The banks could equally, the central bank could have done something different. The central government could have created affordable housing bonds and distributed them to affordable housing agencies around the country, non-profits, cooperatives, whatever. So they're owning this bit of paper. There's a bond. This bond is worth $1 million worth of, what's a bit of paper? What can I do with it? Central bank says, I'll buy it from you. Central bank prints money, buys the bond. The agency now has $1 million. The money is still injected into the economy, but it's given straight to the builders and the plumbers and the electricians and the carpenters and the architects. Same effect. And top economists have said, yeah, you could do that. Why was it never done? Because the central banks and the bankers are dominated by neoclassical economics, who don't understand money, who are there to serve the needs of other people who own lots of money. So if you can have affordable housing bonds, you can also have climate solutions bonds. You can have bonds for, this bond is worth $1 billion of investment in wind turbines, in solar, in home retrofits. You can also issue loans at 0% interest. A government take all student debt and write it down to zero and repay it at 0% interest. They could even take all student debt and write it off entirely, which is what Bernie Sanders is promising to do. When you dig into the new economics and see what's possible. And so when we've got from the need for a new ecological civilization, in practice, that means a Green New Deal. We've got to finance a Green New Deal. And there's about 6 or 7 ways of financing it. There's the normal ways, like you can tax the 1% for some of those billions of dollars they're taking. You can close up on tax havens. You can stop subsidies to oil companies and fossil fuels. You can create a public bank owned by the people, which can issue zero-interest loans. That's how Germany does all its building retrofits, with zero interest and very low interest loans from their public bank. And your central bank can create money and issue bonds to pour the money into the economy to achieve this transition. So I'm sitting on this understanding of here's what we need to do, here's how we can do it, and then, so what is the final factor that's needed? It's 500,000 people in the streets. It's the phenomenal protests which started off just about the climate crisis, and some of them are also talking about ecological crisis. But when that put 2 and 2 together and say, if we tie this to an economic revolution about how we operate our economies, and marry the two together we can then achieve the transition that's needed. And the transition is something I would argue it's going to be very sudden, it's going to be exciting. In simple engineering terms, it's totally natural. We've always got all of our energy from the sun. Clearly, that's where you take the sun away, we're going to freeze to death. About 300,000 years ago, maybe 1 million years ago, we learned how to turn solar energy into firewood. We learned how to make fires with firewood. Now we can keep warm at night, we can keep the bears out of the cave, we can cook our food. So for 1 million years, we also used solar energy as firewood. Then about 300 years ago, we started to discover, oh, solar energy is also locked up in coal and oil and gas. We can use that solar energy. And then because of the engineering that resulted from the Enlightenment, we've now got solar panels that can take solar energy directly. So we're into the fourth age of solar energy, with direct solar energy from the sun through the solar panels and through wind turbines, which are solar devices indirectly, because the sun causes the waves and the wind. But here's the thing, we had 300 years of fossil fuels. The price of solar energy is falling so dramatically. When I started working on this, put it this way, a regular kilowatt hour of electricity in British Columbia costs about 10 cents a kilowatt hour. When I started working on this, a kilowatt hour of solar electricity would cost about 90 cents a kilowatt hour. Then about 5 years ago, it had fallen to about 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Now on the global market, it's selling for 4 cents a kilowatt hour. And every year, the technology improves in efficiency. The same panel generates more energy. So every year that passes, you get more energy from the solar panels for a cheaper cost. And because the sun doesn't start turning into a red giant when we have to evacuate the planet for 3 million years, was it a black dwarf or a red giant? I always get this mixed up. Call it a red giant. For say, just take the next billion years, every single year, the price of solar energy will fall and the efficiency will improve. That's 1 billion years. Even to think about 100 years is beyond our imagination, because all this change has happened in the last 10 years. And so this transition from fossil fuels to solar energy is absolutely, in quotes, natural. When you apply human intelligence and science to nature, you get this kind of result. So when people say, oh, you're standing in the way of progress by your protests and your strikes, they could not be more wrong. To try to demand that we use fossil fuels longer is standing in the way of progress. They are the Luddites of the present world who are demanding we do not make new progress, who are demanding you put taxation on solar energy, which is what's happening in Florida and stuff like that. Because this is, just in purely engineering terms, a very natural progression from fossil fuels to solar, wind, geothermal, tidal, and other forms of renewable energy and massive big batteries. The battery technology is falling in price so much now that new electric vehicles, within 3, 4, 5 years, will cost the same as a conventional vehicle and have a range of 400 kilometers. Now, I drive an electric vehicle. I came down in one this morning. It's plugged in, it's up on Sherman Gen right now. And the average cost of driving 1,000 kilometers in an electric vehicle is less than $10 for 1,000 kilometers when you're driving efficiently. And my servicing bill for the car for the first year is $59, fixed price. So I'm saving $2,000 a year on fuel, and I'm saving another up to $1,000 a year on repairs and stuff like that. I tell you, who's driven an electric car in this room here? Hands up, who's been in an electric car? Just 1, 2. Well, you know they're pretty cool, right? They're just more advanced, more efficient. You have regenerative braking. The crisis is not going to be a crisis of can we get enough electric vehicles? It'll be people wanting them so much that I can't sell my gasoline car anymore. No one wants to buy it. There's going to come a threshold. Say, quick, I better do it quickly, else I'll never get the money out of I want to sell it to some sucker who doesn't understand what electric vehicles are, or someone who can't afford. So, you'll be selling a $15,000 car for $5,000 because no one will want it. That's how quickly this revolution is going to happen during the 2020s. And the whole of the 2020s needs to be seen as this period of rapid change, not just economic change and technological change, but cultural change. When we sort of change from the old, dead civilization of economic growth forever into the new ecological civilization. And here's one of the remarkable things in terms of the economy. All of the evidence around cooperatives, employee ownership, employee-owned businesses, cooperative banks, public banks. They are just as good financially as their privately owned alternative. There's no economic loss. And furthermore, there's a lot of other good things. So the average wage differential in a regular company in North America, depending how I measure it, it's between the lowest worker and the highest worker is like 900 times, 900-fold difference. In Mondragon, which is a town in northern Spain, where they set up cooperatives in 1955, they now have 85,000 people working in a whole network of 100 cooperative businesses. Their wage difference between the low worker and the top manager is 8. An 8-fold wage difference only. Because you need to pay people more if they're working harder and carrying more responsibility. It doesn't work, everyone's paid the same. But 1 to 8 is a heck of a lot different than 1 to 900. And if you take the top corporate owners, you're talking 1 to 9,000 wage difference. That sense of inequality, that sense of injustice, that sense that people are working really hard and making no progress is what is fueling white supremacism and racism around the world in the white countries. When people, older white men like myself, who haven't been able to get ahead financially because they're not among the plutocrats, they feel something's wrong here and they blame the immigrants. Or they blame people with colored skins because they've got to blame somebody. And so it's actually the impulse within all of us to cling to our tribe when we're threatened is pretty deep because it goes right back to ancient times. But when that threat is caused by the economy running along the wrong principles, the thing we need to correct is the economy. So the great thing about the Green New Deal is that it emphasizes how important it is to get these investments into low-income communities, into struggling urban areas, in struggling rural areas. To look at things like the cost of racism over the last 200 years and talk about reparations. The impact of slavery in America and what that's done for black communities. After World War II, all the American soldiers came home, and there were black soldiers and there were white soldiers, and they were given a GI Bill, which is free college education, free cheap loans for business, but if you're black, it somehow didn't apply. You didn't manage to get that stuff. And you weren't allowed to get a mortgage out because the insurance people said, well, that's a dangerous area, we can't lend in that area, so they put a red line around the areas where the black people lived. They could never get into home ownership. They're always renting. And we wonder why there's a huge wealth differential between white and black, because of historical failure to understand the politics of domination and the politics of cooperation. And Karl Marx got it all wrong too, because he understood power, but he said, oh, no. The bourgeoisie, they're the people with all the power who are abusing it. The working class, they're good. When they have the revolution, we'll get utopia. So he had no power analysis that the origins of the corruption of power live within every one of us. So you give the working people the revolution, and suddenly you've got Stalin and Lenin and the worst dictatorship the planet's known for a long time. Because he had no theoretical understanding of power in its anthropological sense, because there wasn't any anthropology in the 1860s, 1850s when Karl Marx was working. So it's really fascinating to untangle the complicated philosophies we've built up that everyone in my generation learnt in college, and no one in my generation studied ecology. No one in my generation studied a mixture of anthropology and political philosophy and economics. And when you put them together, it becomes pretty exciting. So basically, that's the end of my little piece here. I believe, I've spent 3 years working, trying to get down to the simplest, the fundamental causes of our planet's problems are simply ecological ignorance. The solution is ecological knowledge. And I should say, that branches into ecological compassion. Care for animals, love for animals, sympathy, so that, we do for all animals what we do for the whales. And we started the fundamental problem. The first of the 4 causes, ecological ignorance. The solution, ecological knowledge, and I would argue ecological compassion. Second problem is the ancient impulse to dominate. Solution being ancient impulse to cooperate. Bring it back, make it strong. Third fundamental problem, false neoclassical economics. Replace it with real-world economics, also known as heterodox economics, pluralist economics. The fourth problem is our loss of civilizational story, which means loss of purpose, loss of direction. Replace it with the strong vision of a new ecological civilization. Thank you very much.